Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we'll look behind the scenes of the White House Press Corps.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. With me is George Condon, White House correspondent for National Journal. George has covered 8 presidents and traveled to 80 countries, reporting on the presidency. We're also fortunate to have George on the NPF Board of Directors. Today we're talking about the White House Press Corps and the history of the White House Press Corps. George, tell us a bit about the book you're writing.
Well, when I was president of the White House Correspondents Association in 93, 94, I was embarrassed at how little we knew of our own history. We didn't know what years we had had dinners. We didn't know where we had had the dinners. We didn't know who our entertainers were. And we didn't know who our own presidents were. Since our job is writing stories and writing the history, it'd be kind of nice if we knew our own history. So I just started researching, and it ended up being so fascinating that I decided this is a book. So I'm working on that now.
Mm-hmm. And what was the first incidents that you discovered of correspondence between reporters and the president's office?
Well, actually, it was a letter written, I think, 99 years ago today. And it was the White House Press Corps begging for access, something that we still do. That's been a 99-year constant. Begging the president to let us cover his wedding and honeymoon.
And this president was?
President Wilson. And he was very resistant to it because they all remembered the last president who had gotten married in the White House, Grover Cleveland, and he hated the press because of the way they intruded on his honeymoon. And so Wilson didn't want a repeat of that, so he was very resistant. Mm-hmm. So when to show you his response to the letter, when he got married, which was in a small house on DuPont Circle in Washington, they put carbon paper. Now, none of your viewers will remember what carbon paper is, but they put carbon paper on the seal to hide the seal of the presidential seal on the car, and they raced away from the car and hoped that the reporters would go to Union Station, and they went to a train siding in Alexandria and got on the train to go to the honeymoon hotel in the Homestead in Virginia.
And why was Edith Wilson such a rage back in the day? Was she was it a version of People magazine journalism back then?
Well, it's not so much that as just that this is a woman marrying the president of the United States. So no matter who it was, they would have paid attention. Now, the funny thing is, the Georgetown Society people were aghast that he was marrying a shopkeeper, basically, because she was Edith Galt, and she ran the oldest jewelers in Washington, Galt Jewelers, and they just thought that was way below a president's station.
Mm-hmm. And there was an age difference too, right?
There was. I don't remember. It wasn't a huge gap. It wasn't like Grover Cleveland marrying somebody who was like 20, 30 years younger than him.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of criticism of the White House Correspondents' Dinner these days. People think it's gone too Hollywood. But what have you found from your research about that question?
That's a perception that couldn't be more wrong. What's different is you have the red carpet now, which is kind of embarrassing. And you have such a TV-focused, live TV coverage. But the fact is, the dinner, almost from its beginning, has been heavily laced with Hollywood. In fact, at the very first dinner in 1921, they had the editor of Photoplay magazine there, who was the first one who used the phrase, going Hollywood. He invented the phrase, and he was the dinner, and he was at the dinner because he could help get them stars. If you look at the dinners in the 30s and the 40s, the networks, NBC and CBS, to show off this new thing called TV, brought in their biggest stars. So you would have an hour-and-a-half gala show that would include the all-important balloon animals. I mean, what show is complete without balloon animals? And you would have ballroom dancers, opera singers, Frank Sinatra, Milton Berle, Abbott and Costello, Al Jolson. I mean, you went from vaudeville stars to radio stars to TV stars, and it wasn't until really the Nixon presidency. It started to go downhill with Eisenhower, but and Kennedy brought a little flash. They had Barbra Streisand when she was just a teenager. But then with Nixon, it really got to be bad entertainment and boring dinners. Unless you're excited by the Disneyland Golden Horseshoe Review in 1969, or the Mike Curb Congregation, brought in just because they were Republicans. It really was boring. And people just drank at the dinners and didn't pay any attention to things. So you had Petula Clark, who had the #1 hit in the country in downtown. She left the stage in tears because absolutely nobody stopped to listen to her. So the reason they went to in the 80s, early 80s, to a single comedian is because the dinner was dying. And nobody was paying attention to the entertainment. The entertainment was bad, and it was a really boring dinner. And they hoped if they went to a single comedian that people would actually pay attention. And that did work on that. But that changed the dinner there. But this whole myth that it wasn't until Michael Kelly invited Fawn Hall to the dinner that suddenly it opened to celebrities. It was heavily laced with celebrities in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Mm-hmm. And what is the president's relationship with this dinner ban over the years? Have you uncovered any interesting nuggets about past presidents and their interaction with the dinner?
Well, you had, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt absolutely loved the dinner. His very first public event as president was going to the dinner. His almost last public event was going to the dinner. And in fact, I found that the Correspondents Association surreptitiously slipped in a doctor from Johns Hopkins in the 1945 dinner, seated him as close as they could to the president, just to give them a report on the president's health. And his report was very succinct. He's dying. And in fact, he was dead within a month of the dinner, because he went from the dinner. Soon after, he went to Warm Springs, Georgia, and died there. But FDR described it as our organization, our club. He loved the Correspondents' dinner. And the early presidents liked it because FDR couldn't see all this entertainment. There wasn't TV, so it was like a variety show, and it entertained them.
Let's talk a little bit about.
Well, let me add one other thing. That if I mention the president who loved it, I have to mention the president who hated it. I mean, Jimmy Carter hated it, but Richard Nixon really hated it. After the 1971 dinner, he went back to the White House and dictated a 2,000-word memo condemning it. I'll never go to one of these dinners again. They're all drunk, they're crude, they're liberals. And he told his staff, don't ever tell me to go to one of these again.
And did he?
He did. He didn't go the next year in 72, but he went in 73, which was a fascinating dinner because it was the key weekend in Watergate. It was the weekend in Watergate when they were having nonstop meetings. They realized he was going to have to get rid of his top staff, and they all broke from these emergency meetings to go to the dinner with reporters that they hated. And Judge Sirica was at one of the tables, not far away from Haldeman and Ehrlichman. So that was an interesting one.
And did he go in 74?
He was, no, he sent Gerald Ford. He did have one other thing at the 73 dinner. The last of the founders of the Correspondents Association, David Lawrence, the founder of U.S. News and World Report, had just died, the last founder. And Nixon gave a little eulogy to him and said, now, he once told me, Mr. President, the hardest thing a president does is maintain peace, not war. And Nixon was caught on the tapes later that night talking to Haldeman. And he said, did you like that quote I used on Lawrence? And Haldeman said, yes, sir, it was very appropriate. And Nixon said, he never said it, I made it up.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about traveling with the president. I believe you
yes.
found information dating back to Andrew Johnson.
Well, the first time I could see it, there was a version of like the travel office, is Andrew Johnson took what was called the swing around the circle, which was a multi-state campaign thing to try to gain the upper hand with Congress. And the White House arranged a chartered train to get the press there. And so that's held until this day. And we're actually in a week where the whole system of press covering the president is in danger and maybe falling apart. I mean, the current president of the Correspondents Association, Christi Parsons, Chicago Tribune, is doing yeoman service trying to rescue the system. But
can you describe what the problem
is?
Well,
the problem is, and we started dealing with this when I was involved in the association, when Pan Am always did the charters, and they did it at a loss. And when they went bankrupt, probably because of business practices like doing press charters at a loss, the system started to fall apart. You had fewer press organizations traveling. That brought the cost up. And when the cost went up, even fewer went. So you had the first foreign trip I went on with the president in November of '83 with Reagan to Japan and Korea. There were 24 newspapers in what they call the print pool rotation. That meant there were 24 newspapers on the plane traveling. In the last year of George W. Bush, that was 3. You had so many foreign press traveling. That isn't true anymore. So you had the president's just completed trip to where he went to China, Burma, and Australia. A very long trip, and the very size of that trip probably magnified the problems, but you had so few press on the plane. I'm told there were 29 reporters on the last leg of flying on this big plane
compared
from
to
Australia.
Earlier.
And the bill just for airfare, I mean, people think that we don't pay for that, $90,000 per reporter. And if you have some experience with Associated Press, so you know that AP sends more than one staffer on trips. Imagine getting hit with a $90,000 bill, or multiple of that, $180,000 bill in the last month of your budget year. That you can't sustain that. Newspapers are talking about we're going to have to scale back hiring because of this.
Now, you've traveled on Air Force One many times.
Yes.
Can you describe what that's like? There's sort of a mystique about Air Force One. There's lots of movies about it. And
well, despite Harrison Ford's movie, there is no escape pod. What can I say? No, it's a very nice plane. I was on the old Air Force One, the one that was used through the Kennedy assassination, and then was retired by President George H.W. Bush. And then when they went to a bigger plane, a 747, specially outfitted, and it has everything. It has a little hospital for the president. It has very good creature comforts for him, and it has for the press. It's nothing like that, but it is a first class seat. And people think the food must be great. The food is not great. There's this White House lemonade that you get, and the food, and you're actually working too hard to really enjoy much of it, because the president may come back to talk to us, the press secretary may come back, aides may come back. When the president was coming back from the Reykjavik summit, they had so many aides thrown at the press pool that they were, transcribing tapes and interviewing the entire flight from Iceland.
So it's changed over time.
It's changed over time. I mean, it's still. I mean, don't get me wrong. It is special. You're on Air Force One, but it's another office. It's better. I was on Air Force One with Reagan coming back from China in 1984, and that was miserably uncomfortable. You were seated 3 across at a table. The seats would not recline, and I ended up having for much of the flight from Beijing to Alaska for refueling, Helen Thomas had fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder. So and you couldn't stretch your legs out. It was not comfortable. I love Helen, but not that long.
Talk a little bit about how covering the White House has changed over the years, from the days when you were the gatekeepers and really made the decisions about what was transmitted from what the White House said to an audience back home. How has that changed?
Well, it's not just that it's changed at the White House, it's changed overall. I mean, there are news stories, especially in a campaign, where you don't think there's the foundation for it, there aren't enough sources. But whether or not the New York Times, Washington Post, National Journal write about it, it's going to get out. And that's had a bad effect in that candidates and presidents don't think they can ever let their hair down and be themselves with us, because the old days of knowing, that's off the record and you're not going to write that. And we benefited because we got a chance to see, who the candidate was, whether he or she was a real person, and got to know him. Those days are pretty much gone.
And how has social media affected that?
Oh, it's enormous. I mean, the White House recently announced the president was coming out to make an announcement, have a little press conference, and instead of telling AP, Reuters, and the networks, they announced it on Facebook, and they were so proud of themselves. They said, we got 1.5 million views, page views. Well, if you'd given it to AP, you'd get a lot more than 1.5 million. But they're committed to doing that, and actually, I don't have any objection. They should make use of everything available to them. But every president tries to cut out the White House press corps, and they all discover painfully that you can't. The White House press corps still matters.
The president's family, the president's children in particular, have traditionally been, I won't say off the record, but just reporters tend not to report on them. And we had an incident of that recently with the Obama daughters caught at I guess it was the turkey ceremony.
They were looking like teens look. I mean, their father's there making goofy remarks about a turkey. Any parent knows that there's an eye roll that comes when you're embarrassing your kids. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just one aide decided, one Republican aide decided to make fun of them. The weird thing is that way before TMZ and so on, in the old days, the press did really write about the president's children much more than we do now. That's one of the reasons why Woodrow Wilson was so unhappy about the press, because there were so many stories written about his daughters and who they might date or marry. And Teddy Roosevelt's children certainly got written about. It was only in later years that we sort of grew up and had more sensitivity. When I was president of the Correspondents Association, we had meetings with a very skeptical Clinton White House staff, because they thought we were going to savage Chelsea. We were going to stake out her school. We were going to make life miserable. And they wanted her to have a normal upbringing, as normal as you can have when you're living in the White House. And we negotiated with them something called a family pool, where we would have a smaller pool when he had to go to school events, a soccer game or something, because he wanted to arrive not with lights flashing and sirens sounding. He wanted a smaller footprint. And we negotiated that, and they later told me they were shocked that we weren't going to hound her. People wrote about the first day she went to school, and then nobody, not even the tabloids, staked out her school.
Yeah, you've got better things to do.
Yeah,
right.
Well,
right.
and plus, people respect children aren't part of the political discussion. Now, what's if a president were to put the child out there as a political pawn, then the rules change a little bit, because you can't do both. You can't use them politically and then expect us not to ever write about them. And that's what there was some problem in the last campaign that Chelsea, who's now grown up, was supposed to be off the record, off out of bounds to us. But here she is, an adult, traveling with her mother in the campaign, and that wasn't right.
One of the privileges of working at the White House as a reporter is you get to witness moments of history. Could you share with us some of the moments of history that you've witnessed?
That's the best part of covering the White House, because you have the drudgery of being in a van while the president's having dinner, and a lot of bad pool duty. But the good thing is being there when Arafat and Rabin are having their historic handshake on the south lawn of the White House after decades of refusing to acknowledge each other. You had Reagan meeting with Gorbachev in Geneva, or I mentioned the Reykjavik summit, very historic. And to be there and see that happening, or on a different level, not a world leader, being with Reagan at the 40th anniversary of D-Day, walking the beaches of Normandy with a veteran. And I was talking to him, and he was telling me about friends of his who had died on this spot on the beach, and what a brutal day it was. And I looked back, his family had been trailing us, and they were all crying. And they told me later they had never heard any of those stories. He had never, ever talked about D-Day to his own family. It was so painful and so searing to him. And here he was talking to me, and they were learning things about their father. So those moments you remember.
And when you're covering the White House, you also see some very human moments at time from the president or his family. Can you describe some of those that you've seen, or some that you've come across as you've researched this book?
It's hard. This wasn't with the book. It was I was there in Japan. It's hard to get a more human moment than President George H.W. Bush throwing up on the Japanese Prime Minister. And I had been the pool earlier when we were in, he was doing a ribbon cutting for was it a Toys R Us, I think, in a Japanese city. And they were doing some ancient Japanese game with a flaccid deerskin carcass. And the president, while he's watching this, all of a sudden starts kicking it around as if it was a soccer ball, and the Japanese are looking at him, what are you doing? And actually a very human moment, the First Lady, Barbara Bush, always thought that she looked uncaring when you would see the film of the president throwing up, because she looked more angry than concerned. But she knew he wasn't having a heart attack. She was in the position of any wife with a husband. She had told him earlier, you're not feeling well. She knew he had thrown up in the bathroom, and she told him, don't go to the dinner. And he, like most husbands, ignored his wife, and here he was throwing up on the Prime Minister. And she was like any wife, if you had listened to me, you wouldn't be doing this.
What about the Obama presidency? How has it differed from previous presidencies that you've covered?
Well, I mean, they're all somewhat different. I mean, they're trying what every other president tries, to get ways to go around us, and they use the social media as we mentioned. I don't think that we're the favorite group when the president and his staff think about life in the White House. Any
other interesting stories that you've come across that you'd like to share as you've done your research on the book?
I mentioned the Nixon and Watergate. That's one of my favorite. And one thing I did enjoy was I found the stories on the honeymoon, Wilson's honeymoon, because I wanted to see if he had allowed coverage. And sure enough, the president, and this is late December 1915, the president took his bride on their honeymoon out to golf every day in the snow, because he loved golf, much more than Obama does even. And they loved to walk. And so the headline in the New York Times story used a word that I don't think we'd use to describe the president's wife anymore. It said, describing this long walk, "President takes a tramp."
Tramp.
The word tramp had
Took a walk.
Somewhat different meaning then. And
right.
then the subhead, just to be clear, used another word we don't use often. It said, "President engages in pedestrianism."
George, you've traveled to 80 countries. Do you have any memories that you'd like to share about your most favorite moments covering the president abroad? Did I get 80 right? Is that 80?
88.
88.
Actually.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's so many. Reagan. Obviously, I'm partial to Ireland, and when Reagan went to Ireland, the Catholic priest who had done the genealogical study that said he was from Ballyporeen was a distant cousin of mine. It was Father Eamon Condon. So he didn't give any other interviews, but he gave me an interview. And being with Reagan in tiny Ballyporeen was neat. And when he landed, it had been raining, as it always rains in Ireland. And the instant Air Force One landed, there's this rainbow that you could see over Air Force One. Reagan was very lucky in 1984. Mm-hmm. And we went from that to actually to the D-Day. I mean, being at the 40th, the 50th, and the 60th anniversaries of D-Day were very special. Yeah, the superpower summits in Geneva and Reykjavik and the Moscow trips. You're seeing the world change. I went with the first President Bush, visiting the troops in the deserts of Saudi Arabia before he went. And I still remember one enlisted, I was very nervous meeting the president when he had Thanksgiving dinner with him out in the desert. And he went up to the president and he said, it's such an honor to have you here. We so thank you. And Bush, who didn't always respond right away, said, it's like Woody Allen said, 97% of life is just showing up. And this poor corporal had no idea what the president was talking about. It was a nice moment.
Well, George, we look forward to reading the history book about the White House Correspondents Association and having you back here when it's published to tell us more stories about the White House. So thank you, George. We've been joined today by George Condon, White House Correspondent for National Journal.